Welcome to the questions and answers part for session 6 of our lecture on international political economy, in which we discussed your question and answers concerning transnational production. The first question addresses the definition of transnational corporations. It goes like this. I'm having trouble with definitions of TNCs when they are based in the service sector. When can we speak of added value? For example, Facebook. In my understanding, the ideas, developments, and most part of administration, etc., are based in the United States, while in other countries there may be mostly things as a regional customer service, I guess, but wouldn't this be the same as just a store selling the product for companies in the production sector? Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on value added, on what value added means in this context. So this is a good question. Actually, if you remember the definition given in our textbooks, they really only said a transnational corporation is a corporation that has production, in parentheses, value added facilities in more than one country, or at least in two countries. So if we really strictly would limit this to production, then only companies in the industrial sector could count as TNCs, but this wouldn't really make that much sense, because there are important TNCs that are not in the production sector, particularly in the IT sector. And here we have TNCs that are focused on service. So let's leave out Facebook for a second and ask, what is the value added element in services? Here you can ask, okay, where are the services performed that the customers do pay for? For example, there is this mechanism in which, for example, X-ray pictures taken by hospitals in the United States are then not analyzed by doctors in that same hospital, but rather by doctors in India. And this has some advantages. A, doctors in India work at cheaper prices, and B, it can also speed up the process, because if you take an X-ray in the United States in the evening, then doctors will look at it overnight in India, and then you can discuss it with the patient in the next morning, and it happens overnight, for example. So then you could say, well, this hospital in the United States, it offers this medical service of diagnostics on something that you need X-rays for. So some of the services performed in the United States, namely taking the X-ray picture and also then discussing it with the patient. However, the analysis part is done in India, and then you can say, well, there is some value added to this service in India. Similarly, you can argue about financial services. So where are the services that are offered performed? And there are always difficulties with services there. If you look at Facebook, you always have to be aware that the service that Facebook offers is actually not really the service that most Facebook users use, because you don't pay for anything, and that's not how Facebook makes money. Facebook makes money by selling ads. So the customers of Facebook are those who put their ads on Facebook. And then you, as a everyday Facebook user, you're just part of their raw material that they get for free, because so many of us are so nice to give up our own content for free on Facebook. And then you have to ask, okay, are significant parts of the work that needs to be done to offer this service performed in Germany and or in Europe, in countries other than the United States? And then you find that there are centers of Facebook in different countries. However, you're right that they are rather small as compared to what they do in the United States. Yet you could argue that some of the services they offer are performed here. However, with these kinds of online services, it really gets complicated. I'm not sure whether this was a satisfying answer, but it's the best I can give right now. Next, how do stock calculations of speculators and rankings in the transnational capital market, FPIs, influence the process of production, e.g. do companies or the TNCs consider interests of speculators in their decision making and thus concentrate also more on short-term profits? Do they enhance the negative effects of investment in developing countries? So what you're aiming at here is what we typically call shareholder value capitalism. So this is a form of capitalism where those who make the decisions within the companies put a lot of emphasis on satisfying the shareholders, and they satisfy the shareholders by making sure that the stock prices remain high, and also that reasonable dividends are paid to the shareholders. And today this is an important part of how the executive management of companies operate. So they care a great deal about shareholder value. And you could ask, why do they do so? It's why would they even care about the stock value? That's just a problem of the shareholders and not the problem of the company. However, there are good reasons why the executive management cares a lot about shareholder value. So for one, it can always be that the company might decide to issue more stocks in order to get more capital, and then of course it's better if the stock prices are high, because then they have better chance of selling them and getting a lot of money when they need to recapitalize on the stock market. However, that's only a small part of the story. Another part of the story is that those who make decisions in companies often themselves are shareholders, particularly at the higher levels. And third, it's also that they have to respond to the shareholders' meetings. So if the management makes decisions that make the stock prices of a company fall, then the shareholders lose money, and then they will not only scold the management at the next session, they might also decide to replace it with some other management. If, however, the value of the stocks go up and big dividends are paid, then the shareholders might decide to even give the management some bonus in payment. So in today's capitalism, managers of companies do have very strong incentives to emphasize the shareholder value. And this, as you yourself asked in the question, does put a strong emphasis on short-term interests. So if you have an idealized view of what capitalism was back in the day when there were family companies, then these family companies might have operated on very long-term perspectives and thought, well, we make this investment now and we stick in it despite of we having a hard time right now, because we hope this will pay out in the future at the end. And anyways, we get maybe 2% return on investment and we can easily live by that, and that's fine. However, in shareholder value capitalism, stockholders don't have that much patience, and so managers have incentive to look at the short-term profits more than at long-term profits. And this, of course, changes the way they do business. And as you asked, this also, of course, means that when a transnational corporation moves into a country, then they will have to make the case that this is profitable in the short term and that the profits are high. And if they cannot show this, then this whole venture is deemed a failure and they have to cancel it. So they really have to push their activities to be as profitable in the short term as possible. And this, of course, can be at odds with the interest of having sustainable development in that country. So even if we don't use terms such as speculators, but only speak of shareholders and not necessarily in the sense of venture capital that's only wants to hold stocks for a very short time, but also a little bit more long-sighted investment, then the dynamics that you aim at are real. So transnational corporations have the short-term interest in mind, and sustainable development might not be in that calculation. Next question is related to this. Are TNCs beneficial to the majority of its origin country's population apart from its shareholders? The answer to this question is yes and no. So there are definitely more people that benefit from the success of a transnational corporation than only the shareholders. And we're speaking of people in their home country. So if we speak of General Motors, we speak of the United States. If we speak of Nestle, we speak of Switzerland, and so on and so on. So of course, oftentimes the majority of the shareholders will sit in this home country, so they are one group who benefit. However, we also have management. Okay, this you might argue is such a small group. However, as the textbook elaborates, some of the high paid jobs within TNCs are typically within the central of the firm which is in the home country. So there are a lot of the better jobs that the company has to offer are within the home country. And of course, the more successful the company is on global markets and in global production, the more jobs in research and development will it be able to offer in the home country. And of course, these high wage workers will then also pay taxes, so the state will also benefit from this. Does this necessarily mean that the majority of the population will benefit? This is rather doubtful. You can make this case and say, well, if so many people in Germany have high-paying jobs at Volkswagen and at Daimler-Benz and BMW and so on, then this drives the wealth of the whole population, and you can make this case. However, the connection is probably not that direct, that the more these companies thrive, the better the majority of the population does. This is not that certain, I would say. How do countries with scarce capital increase theirs through inflows of FDI, since these investment and any reinvested profits from them will be owned by a foreign firm? We have to distinguish two things here. So first, the lack of capital in this least developed country means that there will be hardly any production of or any capital intensive production, which means hardly any large scale organized production. And if a transnational corporation comes in with foreign direct investment and builds a production facility there, then there will be some jobs and there will be some stuff produced in the country, which means some gains there at least. And this is something that you can already count as a positive. However, this might have very limited effects if this is only a very superficial interaction with the country, and if the jobs in this facility are only low value added, low paying jobs, then this will not help much. And you can see this if you look at a second thing, which is the growth of the capital stock within the country. So the capital stock is the total amount of capital that is there within a certain entity. So you can speak of the capital stock of a company, or also as of the capital stock within the whole country, which means all the capital that all the companies and individuals in this country own. And if we have this kind of interaction that I just described, then the capital stock in the country will not really grow, for the capital may be located in the country, so the factory stands there, but if nothing remains there and if all the profits are extracted, then not much might remain there. However, if there is then interaction with local businesses, then it might also be that they can build up their businesses and then they might also receive knowledge from those interaction with the transnational corporations, and then it might happen that local capital can be built, and that the capital stock in the country that is owned by people from that country might also grow. And this is something that we saw in many successful economies in Asia in particular. So there you can distinguish those two kinds of positive effects, and the one is not really that big, but it's already there and might already be sufficient to make some case for foreign direct investment, but it really only works out in long term if we also have these kinds of interaction that help local businesses build up local capital stock. The fact that TNCs evade legal frameworks because they consider it unfavorable, wouldn't it be punishable by the law? Here you have to distinguish evading legal frameworks from breaking the law. So, for example, it might be that the consumption of certain drugs is forbidden in one state, but it's allowed in another state. And a person who wants to consume that drug might just go on holiday to the other state and do their consumption there, and then go back to their home state and have consumed the drugs they wanted to consume, and thereby evaded the legislation prohibiting them from using that drug in their home country. But they wouldn't have broken any laws because they only used it where it was legal. And this is of course something as an individual that is only temporary good, because you can only do it while you're in the other country, and typically you have to be in your home country for most of the time because you have to study, you have to work, whatever you do, you might have family there and so on. Transnational corporations, however, have the big advantage that they can be in 50 countries at the same time, and if the legal framework is flexible enough, then they might just make the case that all the things that matter happen in the countries where it is legal and where the framework is most favorable to them. And some of these things are then legal but questionable. So, for example, you could just put those production steps that produce the highest pollution to those countries where regulation on pollution are the lowest, and this is kind of the same thing as consuming the drugs where it's allowed. However, it's of course bad if you think about this in a global perspective, but as long as there are no global regulations, that's just that. And there are also some other things where it's more sort of foul play. So many of these companies just claim that they make their profit in a certain country where there is very low taxation. So this might be the Cayman Islands, this might be the Netherlands. So they just have to pay taxes for their profits somewhere. So they just decide, well, this is our headquarters, this is where we pay our taxes. So, we only have to pay 1% of taxes here, that's too bad, it's not our fault. So this is kind of foul play, and this is what governments try to work against. But since the governments don't speak with one voice here, TNCs can still operate this way. In regards to transnational corporations, the 7th chapter of the book seems to lack the political side of the story. That is, they fail to show how transnational corporations were used by the United States after the end of World War II as a way of projecting power. Even today, China uses its corporation to exert influence in the countries where these corporations invest. Moreover, certain claims by the authors that, for instance, the production of certain goods is no longer viable in the developed world are rather inaccurate and are given without an explanation. So this is obviously not a question, but rather a comment. However, I can still give an answer to it and say yes. So yes, the expansion of transnational corporations is not something that happened independent from the governments, but there is a strong interaction between governments of the home country of TNCs and the actions of the home countries. There are often direct links of the people that make the decision in both things, and there are shared interests. So transnational corporations can rely on their government to do their bidding, and in turn national governments sometimes can use the operations of their companies to project power, and this is an important operation. However, I think there were some remarks on this in the textbook. So they make this case that at least that the governments help their TNCs. They make this case with Spain, for example. The second point here I can also agree with is that saying that that the production of certain goods is not viable in the richer countries, that wouldn't be true. I'm not sure which formulation exactly the textbook chose. However, the thing is that it's cheaper to produce them somewhere else, so it's more profitable to produce them somewhere else. And if some companies do this, then it is no longer profitable and therefore no longer viable to produce them in the richer countries, at least on a large scale. So it would of course be possible to satisfy all the demand for t-shirts with t-shirts produced in Germany. There's nothing that keeps Germans from producing t-shirts in Germany. However, producing them in Bangladesh or Turkey or Sri Lanka is much cheaper than producing it here. So there are only very, very few t-shirts produced in Germany, and those are only in the high price segment because there are some people who are willing to pay these prices for them. But if you were to produce millions and millions and millions of t-shirts in Germany, you would have to charge the prices that you have to charge to pay your workers, and then you're not competitive with those producing in Bangladesh. So is it no longer viable to produce it here? That's not the case. Is it profitable and for an individual company reasonable to produce them here? No, it's probably not. So you see, I'm a little bit defending our textbook here. Next, TNCs have a significant impact on the policies of the countries concerned. How can we explain the impact of the big Chinese companies in Africa on the politics of these countries, especially in the face of EU states? I think part of the answer to this question is just referring to the last slide and the last comment. It is that there's always a close relationship between the governments and the TNCs that are at home in the countries of these governments. However, this relation is particularly close when it comes to China, and there you can even argue that the distinction of Chinese government and Chinese TNCs is entirely artificial. And you can make a similar case about Russia, I guess. So you can say there is a strong connection between Siemens or Volkswagen and the German federal government. That's a case you can make, and they all have each other's phone number, and they probably interact quite frequently. And if Angela Merkel goes on a business trip to China, then the managers from German corporations travel with her and make the business deal. So there is this strong connection. However, you cannot really make the case that the German government makes the decision in these German companies or the other way around. However, in China, you can make this case. So whenever an African government deals with the Chinese TNC, they also know that they are dealing with the Chinese government. On the other hand, this means that these Chinese TNCs are also always aware that they have the Chinese government behind them. So they can be much more faithful in performing their investments in China than, for example, European TNC would be, because they might get some credit guarantee by their government, but it's not the same as having the government behind you. And also state-run TNCs from China, they don't have to be that profitable. What I explained before as to shareholder value, value capitalism, that does not really apply to the big Chinese corporations, because they don't have to satisfy the shareholders, they have to satisfy the Chinese government, and the Chinese government might be more interested in exerting influence in Africa than they are interested in getting a high dividend or a high return on investment there. Is the idealized view of the political economy going to become reality? What is the future of TNCs in re-establishing trust in a rule-based global order? The short answer to the first question is no. So this idealized view, which I only created for a national political economy, this was never reality and will never be reality, and even less will it ever be reality on a global scale. Because the assumption there is that the state is independent from the businesses, and the state makes these decisions on the legal framework, and this is one thing, and then those businesses just operate within the legal framework given by the state. However, in reality, the political elites in the state and the business elites, they are always connected with one another. So there is always this intermingling. So this idealized view is not even ever realistic in the national arena. So what can we do about this? Of course, we can have some rules limiting the influence of businesses on politics, and that's a good thing, and we should have this. So when it comes to financing parties and financing political campaigns, then we should have limits, and we should have transparency and all these things, and that's a good thing. Also, there has to be organized counterpower. So the trick here is not to simply separate the operations of the state from the operation of societal interest. Rather, we have to make sure that all groups in society that have interest have a chance to make their interest heard in the political arena. So what we need there is that not only the businesses interact with the state in creating the rules, but also the trade unions, maybe customer organizations, or other kind of interest groups within society, or maybe also feminist organizations, anti-racist organizations, and so on. So they all have to be able to also make their voices heard. So the answer is not isolation, but pluralism here. So much for probably the best we can, the best approximation we can hope for to this liberal ideal of the state that's independent from business interests and only gives the framework in which businesses do business. If we look at the global arena, and if we look at the operations of transnational corporations, it is even less likely that we'll ever get anywhere close to these kinds of ideals where we have this politics that's independent from the transnational corporations, because there is no big global political framework. It always needs the agreement and the interactions of governments. The governments have strongly differing interests, and they also have sometimes interest to rather help the TNCs than to help other governments. So it gets even harder here. And probably the best one can get there is also that you have to organize and help organizing counter forces to the interest of the TNCs, and also that you have to have some sort of global governance agreements where states try to act in the mutual interest of these states and not in the interest of the transnational corporations. However, this is always difficult because there's always the incentive for one state to break out and be on the side of the transnational corporations to attract them to their country. And it's also important that policies are done just on the national level to rein in transnational corporations. For example, when it comes to, let's say, the environmental standards or workplace safety standards, then Germany cannot regulate what happens in Bangladesh or in some other place where stuff is produced. However, of course, Germany can regulate what is legal to sell in Germany. And of course, Germany could make a law saying t-shirts can only be sold in Germany if the production process transparently meets such and such standards. Of course, the German government could do this and other government could also do this. This will of course harm consumers in their country. It would probably harm their own TNCs more than others. However, if they were willing to do so and if they were willing to team up with other governments and transnational organizations to go down this road, and there would be transnational organizations who would gladly go down this road, for example, the International Labour Organizations, then there would be a certain chance to rein in transnational corporations more than they can be reined in right now. However, for the time being, it's probably also always necessary to keep the transnational corporations themselves in the loop on something, and also make them responsible for respecting human rights. In spite of this being somewhat against this liberal idea of the state being responsible for this, is probably not feasible to avoid getting transnational corporations in on this. From my point of view, TNCs are political actors in the moment they start to interfere in the political sphere. So when a big company donates money to political campaigns, they start to act in the sphere and become small political actors. What is your opinion on this? My opinion on this is that you have a very narrow view of what politics is. So wouldn't you say it's also an interference of TNCs in politics if a law is proposed and the CEO of a company calls up with the head of state and says, well, we don't really like this law, don't you want to think about it? So is this already an interference and these kind of things happen? Or if we have, let's say, the World Economic Forum in Davos, and they have their talks there, and then heads of governments are invited as guests to participate in the discussions. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm only saying that politics and economics are not separated there, and there are a lot more informal relations. Or if let's say former politicians sit on the boards of transnational corporations, which the politicians of course know beforehand, and they will earn a lot of more money on these boards than they earn as politicians. Or if the other way around, as we for example oftentimes see in American politics, if executives from companies change to the political sphere, and a manager from Wall Street Bank stops being a manager there, becomes a high-ranking official in the Ministry of Finance, and then later returns to Wall Street. So we have all kinds of connections there, and we should not only limit our focus to campaign finance. How a transnational corporation could be affected in case the state where a TNC activates is hit by economic sanctions, e.g. Russian Federation? Can economic sanctions represent a risk for TNC which works in Russia, or is it excluded? Yes, this is a risk, and it of course depends on how these sanctions are formulated. The example that I know better is that of Iran, which is also targeted by sanctions from the United States, but not only from the United States. And these sanctions forbid companies from all over the world to have certain business ties to Iran. And if these companies have these business interactions with Iran, then they will be punished in the United States. And of course, the United States could not simply punish a German enterprise working with Iran, because that's none of their business and they have no legislation in Germany or Iran. However, all German enterprises basically also want access to the American market. So if they want this access, then they can be punished by the United States. And of course, the US-American market is much more important to German companies than the Iranian market. So in spite of the German government and some other European states saying, okay, we'll jump in, we'll help you companies, we want the business with Iran to be kept up, whatever we think of this stance of the European governments, they took it. Despite of this, many companies decided to try not to make the United States angry, so they decided to cut their business ties with Iran. There are still business ties between European companies and Iran. However, they are not as big as they would be without the US-American sanctions. So what does this mean as pertaining to the question? Of course, it's a risk that companies take if they invest in a country where sanctions are looming or likely. So if the United States threatens a country with sanctions and says, well, country, if you do this and this and this, then we'll sanction you, and you run a transnational corporation, not from the United States, not from this country, and you think about investing in that country, then you will better think twice, because it might be that you invest $100 million in some facilities there, and then the United States will say, well, you shouldn't do business with Iran, so get out there, and then some of your investment will be lost, and that's something you don't want to do. So that's something that managers of these companies will probably have in their calculation. So the mere threat of sanctions may already change the actions of businesses. You talked about the BRICS and their investment. However, for me it seems that the BRICS is not quite as influential as it is portrayed. When we look at countries, Brazil struggles with its economy, Russia is faltering economically, and about South Africa I don't want to begin to talk about. It seems only China and India are in good economic shape. And once again, I would say you're probably right there. And we must say that this focus on the BRICS, on Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, it became fashionable in the beginning of the 21st century. So 10 years ago, there was a lot of talks about BRICS, or maybe also 15 years ago. And at some points, it even seemed that these countries fared better or some of these countries fared better in the global recession of 2009 than the developed countries. So this seemed to be a good case. However, in recent years, the countries that you mentioned witnessed great economic difficulties. So this talk about BRICS, it's really not that much point to it anymore. However, it might change once again in the next 5 or 10 years. If you look at Russia, for example, a lot in Russia depends on A, the oil price, and B, the economic sanctions. So if the oil prices rise once again, and if sanctions are lifted, then the Russian economy will probably do much better once again. But those are two ifs, of course. So you're right, it's not as big a thing as people used to say it was. However, it might become bigger once again, and China and India are big things. You said that the global economy will decline due to the pandemic. Apart from that, I was asking myself if economy always aims to grow, or whether there will be a point reached where it neither grows nor declines, or do economic cycles still follow the Kotradiev waves? Is infinite growth even useful according to an economic perspective? I don't want to go into all the details here. However, if we want to have a capitalist economy that's working in the sense of that production happens and people have jobs on the job market and businesses invest their money so the production will remain, then we need growth. There can be no capitalism without economic growth. It will not happen, because then the businesses have no incentive to invest, and the whole cycle will not work. This cycle of capitalism only works if there is the perspective of growth. However, I want to make one little point here. That's not exactly the question. However, it's some confusion that often happens, because there is oftentimes this argument that people say, well, we live in a world that is not endless, so the world has limited resources. How can we have infinitive growth in a world that has limits? This is a bit of a misunderstanding, because at least in theory, economic growth doesn't necessarily mean that ever more resources are used and ever more stuff is produced, in the sense of greater tonnage of stuff is produced. It can very well be that that production overall, if we talk about metric tons, and if we talk about consuming coal or gas or whatever resources we talk about, will decline physically, while there will still be growth economically. For example, if we have very high values concentrated in very small amounts of, or in very light goods that only use very little resources, then we might have economic growth without this kind of growth that is a growth of the usage of resources. For example, if we only produce power by not burning fossil fuels, and if we produce things that are very small and therefore use little resources, but they take a lot of effort and a lot of work, and if we consume a lot of services rather than products, then we might see that there will be economic growth, because the stuff that is consumed will be worth ever more. However, this economic growth could still happen at a point where the total use of resources is in decline. As I said, in theory, and this case is often made in favor of green capitalism. However, the actual existing capitalism does not seem to be working this way. It might work this way if the political regulations favor this kind of development. However, it's not so easy to make these kind of political regulation against the will of businesses. And as I said before, business and politics are strongly intertwined. So if you take all this into account, then you can say, well, this is a mere in theory argument about economic growth without physical growth. So we can't have growth forever. Then, however, you also have to draw the conclusion that we cannot have capitalism forever. Could you maybe again highlight the main characteristics of Fortism and Toyotism? Yes. So first of all, I would guess that pretty much all of you have heard the term Fortism at one point in their lives, but probably fewer people of you will have heard the word Toyotism, and that's totally okay, because the term Fortism is very, very widely used, and the term Toyotism is not used as widely. And it's also the case that the term Fortism is used for a certain regime of production, but also as a shorthand for a whole way to structure the society, while the term Toyotism is mostly used pertaining to production. So what does both mean? Fortism often comes together with Taylorism. Fortism mainly means mass production, it means production on production lines, and it means production in a way in which workers are paid wages that will enable them to buy the products that they produce. Taylorism, which typically goes together with Fortism, means dividing up production processes into ever smaller, ever more standardized parts, so where every worker only has to do one step and they always have to do the same hand movement a couple of thousand times per day. And this is of course very tiring for the worker, but in Taylor's theory it's the most effective way to produce. Of course you can only produce this way if you produce in masses. So Fortism is all about mass production by standardization. And if we take Fortism as a shorthand for social developments, then we will also say that these social developments are also highlighted by mass consumption and also by standardization. So maybe we live in the very similar high rises, we have very similar family relations, we have very similar social models, and all of these things kind of get standardized, and our everyday practices also get standardized. So Fortism is all about standardization and dividing up processes to make them more effective by having economies of scale. Toyotism was developed, as you might have guessed, in Japan after World War II, and it was developed within the company Toyota, obviously, in order to grapple with certain challenges that they faced in production in Japan. And the idea was here not to reduce cost by standardization and mass production, but rather by flexibility. So in order to have for this production, you just have to produce great vast amounts of the ever same stuff, and stuff has to be done the same way ever and ever and ever again. So thereby you gain economies of scale, but of course you lose flexibility. So you cannot simply shift your production from one product to the other, because all these processes are so normalized and standardized to one certain product. In Toyotism, you try to be more flexible and you try to save money with this flexibility. So you don't do the same thing ever and ever again, but rather you try to see, okay, what is demanded, what is needed, and then you adjust your production exactly to that what is needed, and you don't produce as much excess production. And then you also have to organize work differently, because then you cannot do this tailorization. So Toyotism is typically also marked by group work and by not so steep and not so many levels of hierarchy. So we have sort of this flat hierarchy group production where workers might have been taken more seriously, or not workers but employees are taken more seriously. And what we also have there then is this just-in-time principle. So with Fortism we have great amounts of supplies that are processed in the same way ever again. And in Toyotism we try to meet a certain specific demand. So then you of course don't do this by keeping all the parts in stock that you might need, but you do it by working with suppliers that can supply you with the right parts that you need at just the right time. And this means that you don't have to keep as much stuff in stock as when you do forest production, but it also means that you cannot just work with gazillions of suppliers all over the world, because these kinds of of shipping operations are vulnerable. So you have to work with few suppliers that you can really rely on and that specifically give you what you demand there. So those are two different ways to structure your business, and this Toyotist model is said to be much more flexible, and as you might hear, it all sounds much more modern, but you shouldn't romanticize any of these models. Work is never fun in either of these models. Final question. In my eyes, the exchange rate poses a big risk in foreign investment. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Yes, I can, but not today. I will elaborate more on this in 2 weeks' time after the Pentecost break, when we'll discuss international finance. So until then, I hope you have a great break, and I'll see you.